The pain tore through Violet Grayson's ankle like a branding iron pressed against bare flesh, and she stumbled backward into the wild raspberry bushes, her wicker basket tumbling to the ground and scattering its precious contents across the rocky Colorado soil. She had only meant to venture a short distance from the wagon trail leading into Leadville, drawn by the promise of plump berries glistening in the afternoon sunlight of July 1879. Now, as she looked down at the two puncture wounds already beginning to swell on her pale skin, she understood with terrifying clarity that she had made a fatal mistake. The rattlesnake that had struck her was already slithering away through the tall grass, its warning rattle coming too late to do her any good. Violet pressed her trembling hands against the ground, trying to steady herself as waves of nausea began to roll through her stomach. She was 19 years old, had survived the journey from St. Louis to Colorado Territory with her aunt and uncle just 3 months prior. And now she was going to die alone in the wilderness because she had been foolish enough to wander away from the established paths. Her aunt had warned her about the dangers, but Violet had always been headstrong, always convinced that she knew better than everyone else. The irony of her situation would have been amusing if terror had not been squeezing her chest like a vise. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The wagon trail was perhaps 200 yards away, but it might as well have been 200 miles. Her leg was already beginning to feel heavy, the venom spreading through her bloodstream with each frantic beat of her heart. Violet knew she should try to remain calm, should try to slow her pulse, but panic was a living thing inside her chest, clawing at her ribs and stealing her breath. The sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush made her head snap up, hope and fear warring in her chest. What emerged from the tree line was not one of the miners from town or a fellow traveler, but a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun, and arms thick with muscle that strained against the rough fabric of his shirt. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were what caught her attention. They were a startling shade of gray, like storm clouds rolling across the peaks, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget, for just a moment, about the fire spreading through her leg. "Rattlesnake," she managed to gasp out, pointing at her ankle with a shaking hand. "It bit me." The mountain man was beside her in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees with a grace that seemed impossible for someone of his size. His hands were large and rough with calluses, but surprisingly gentle as he examined her ankle, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. "When?" His voice was deep and rough, like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "Just now. Maybe a minute ago." "I did not see it until it was too late." Without another word, he pulled a large knife from the sheath at his belt. Violet's eyes widened in alarm, but before she could protest, he had already made 2 small incisions across the puncture wounds. She cried out at the sharp pain, but he was already lowering his mouth to her ankle, his lips pressing against her skin as he began to suck at the wound. The intimacy of the gesture, the warmth of his mouth against her flesh, would have scandalized her under any other circumstances. But as she watched him spit dark blood onto the ground beside them, then return to his task with single-minded determination, she felt only gratitude and a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the venom coursing through her veins. He repeated the process 3 times before finally sitting back on his heels and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Got most of it, I think, but you need a healer and you need one fast. How far did you come from the trail?" "I was traveling to Leadville with my aunt and uncle, but I wandered off to gather berries." Her words were beginning to slur together, and the world was starting to tilt at odd angles. "Leadville is 10 miles from here. There is a woman who lives about 3 miles north, an old Ute woman who knows healing better than any doctor in these mountains. I am taking you to her." He did not wait for her response, did not ask her permission. He simply scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed no more than the empty basket lying forgotten in the grass. Violet wanted to protest, wanted to insist that she could walk, but her body had other ideas. Her head lolled against his chest, and she could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her cheek. He smelled of pine trees and wood smoke and something else, something wild and untamed that made her feel both safe and utterly out of her depth. "What is your name?" she whispered as he began to move through the forest with long, sure strides. "Garrett Quinn. Most folks call me the Wolf on account of I spend more time with them than with people. Violet Grayson. Most folks call me reckless on account of I do foolish things like wander away from wagon trails." She felt rather than heard the low rumble of laughter in his chest. "Well, Miss Grayson, your recklessness might have just saved your life. I was tracking a wounded elk and heard you fall. Another few minutes and I would have been too far away to hear anything at all. Then I suppose I should thank Providence for small mercies." Her voice was growing weaker now, and she could feel consciousness beginning to slip away from her like water through her fingers. "Stay with me," Garrett commanded, his arms tightening around her. "Keep talking. Tell me about St. Louis." "Why do you care about St. Louis?" "I do not. But I care about keeping you awake." Violet tried to focus, tried to gather her scattered thoughts into something resembling coherence. "It was crowded and loud. Too many people pressed too close together. I could not breathe there. My parents died of fever when I was 16, and I went to live with my Aunt Martha and Uncle Joseph. They decided to come west to open a general store in Leadville, and I begged them to let me come along. I wanted space. I wanted to see mountains and forests and all the wild things I had only read about in books. And now that you have seen them, I think perhaps I should have paid more attention to the parts of those books that mention the dangers." Another rumble of laughter. "You have spirit, I will give you that. Most women would be crying and carrying on by now. Would crying help? No. Then it seems a waste of energy I cannot spare." Garrett adjusted his grip on her, and Violet realized with a start that he was not even breathing hard despite the pace he was maintaining, and the fact that he was carrying her full weight. His strength was extraordinary, something beyond what she had thought humanly possible. Every muscle in his arms and chest was rigid with effort, but he moved as smoothly as if he were simply out for an afternoon stroll. The forest around them was dense with lodgepole pines and aspens, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Violet caught glimpses of blue sky through the canopy overhead, and once she saw a hawk circling high above them, riding the thermals with lazy grace. Under any other circumstances, she would have been enchanted by the beauty of it all. Now, however, she could feel her body growing heavier, her thoughts becoming increasingly muddled. "Tell me about you," she mumbled, fighting to keep her eyes open. "Why do they call you the Wolf?" "Because I was raised by them, near enough. My parents were killed by Comanche raiders when I was 8 years old. I survived by hiding in a root cellar while they burned our homestead to the ground. After that, I ran. Ran until I could not run anymore, and then I collapsed in these very mountains. A she-wolf found me, half dead from exposure and starvation. Her pack took me in, and I lived with them for nearly a year before a trapper found me and brought me back to civilization." "That is impossible. You are calling me a liar." There was no heat in his words, only mild curiosity. "I am saying that it sounds like something from a dime novel, not real life." Perhaps real life is stranger than you have been led to believe. Violet wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the logical inconsistencies in his story, but her tongue felt thick and clumsy in her mouth. The venom was winning, dragging her down into darkness despite Garrett's efforts to extract it. She could feel herself slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Stay with me, Violet." Garrett's voice was sharper now, commanding. "Do not you dare leave, do you hear me? Do not you dare." But the darkness was too seductive, too strong. Violet's eyes fluttered closed and she knew nothing more. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments and pieces, like a shattered mirror slowly being reassembled. Violet became aware first of warmth, of soft furs beneath her body and a crackling fire nearby. Then came the smell of sage and something else, something bitter and medicinal that made her nose wrinkle. Finally, she heard voices speaking in low tones, one deep and familiar, the other softer and surprisingly melodic. "You did well to bring her quickly," the woman's voice was saying. "Another hour and the venom would have reached her heart. As it is, she will recover, though she will be weak for several days. I should not have stopped to extract the venom." Garrett's voice was tight with something that might have been self-recrimination. "It slowed me down. If you had not, there would have been more venom to neutralize." "You likely saved her life twice over, Garrett Quinn. Do not second-guess your instincts now." Violet tried to open her eyes, but her lids felt as though they had been weighted down with stones. She managed a small sound, somewhere between a moan and a sigh, and immediately both voices fell silent. "She wakes," the woman said. "Good. That is very good." Violet felt a cool hand press against her forehead, pushing back the damp hair that clung to her skin. With tremendous effort, she forced her eyes open and found herself staring up at a weathered face framed by long gray braids. The woman was old, perhaps 60 or 70, with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes as black as obsidian. She wore a dress made of deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and around her neck hung a necklace of turquoise and silver. "Welcome back, child," the woman said with a gentle smile. "I am called Winter Moon by those who know me. You are safe here." "Where is here?" Violet's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "My home, 3 miles north of where you encountered the snake. Garrett brought you to me, and I have been treating you with the old medicines. The venom has been purged from your system, but you must rest now. Your body has been through a great trial." Violet's eyes searched the room until they found Garrett standing near the door of what appeared to be a small cabin constructed of logs and mud. He looked even larger in the confined space, his head nearly brushing the low ceiling. His gray eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You stayed," she said, surprised by the realization. "Did you think I would leave you with a stranger and simply walk away? I do not even know you. That has not stopped you from trusting me with your life." He had a point, though Violet was not quite ready to admit it. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room began to spin around her. Winter Moon's hands were there instantly, guiding her back down onto the furs with surprising strength. "Foolish child," the old woman chided, though her tone was affectionate. "I said you must rest, and I meant it. The poison may be gone, but your body needs time to heal. You will stay here tonight, and tomorrow we will see how you fare. My aunt and uncle, they will be worried. They will think I am dead." "Do they know where you were gathering berries?" Garrett asked. Violet tried to remember, but her memories of the morning felt distant and hazy. "I told my aunt I was going to walk along the trail for a bit, to stretch my legs. She was busy preparing our midday meal and told me not to wander far, but I do not think I mentioned the berries. Then they will assume you simply wandered too far and became lost. It happens often enough in these mountains. I will ride into Leadville tomorrow and let them know you are safe and recovering. They can come fetch you when Winter Moon says you are strong enough to travel. You would do that. Ride 10 miles just to ease the minds of strangers. Your aunt and uncle, yes. Strangers to me, but not to you. And you are not a stranger anymore, are you? The way he said it, the weight behind those simple words, made something warm and unfamiliar bloom in Violet's chest. She had known this man for only a few hours, and for most of that time she had been unconscious or delirious. Yet there was a connection between them, something she could not name but could feel as surely as she felt the furs beneath her body. Winter Moon was watching them both with knowing eyes, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. I will prepare some broth for the girl. She needs nourishment. Garrett, there is fresh water in the barrel outside if you wish to wash. It was a clear dismissal, and Garrett took it with good grace. He nodded once to Violet, his eyes holding hers for a long moment, and then he ducked through the low doorway and disappeared into the fading light outside. That one has claimed you as his, Winter Moon said matter-of-factly as she moved to the fire and began ladling liquid from a pot hanging over the flames. I beg your pardon. Do not play coy with me, child. I have lived too long and seen too much to be fooled by false modesty. The wolf looks at you the way a man looks at something precious, something worth protecting. And you look at him the same way, whether you admit it yet or not. Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with her recent fever. You are mistaken. We have only just met. He is simply a good man who happened upon someone in need of help. If you believe that, then you are blind as well as foolish. Winter Moon brought the broth over and helped Violet sit up enough to drink, supporting her with one strong arm while holding the cup to her lips with the other. I knew Garrett Quinn when he was a wild thing, more wolf than boy. I was the one who helped the trapper teach him to speak like a human again, to remember the ways of his people. He does not trust easily, does not let others close. Yet he carried you 3 miles through rough terrain without stopping to rest, and he has not left your side since we began the treatment. That is not the behavior of a man who simply happened upon someone in need. The broth was rich and savory, warming Violet from the inside out. She drank it slowly, considering Winter Moon's words. There was truth in them, she had to admit. She had seen the concern in Garrett's eyes, the way his jaw had tightened when the old woman spoke of how close Violet had come to death. But surely that was simply common decency, the natural reaction of any good person to the suffering of another. Yet even as she tried to convince herself of this, Violet could not forget the feeling of being in his arms, the sense of absolute safety that had enveloped her despite the dire nature of her circumstances. She could not forget the intimacy of his mouth on her ankle, the way he had not hesitated for even a moment before doing what was necessary to save her life. And she certainly could not forget the way her heart had skipped when he said she was no longer a stranger. I do not know him, she said quietly, more to herself than to Winter Moon. Then perhaps you should remedy that, the old woman replied. The spirits brought you together for a reason. It would be foolish to ignore their guidance. Violet wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she did not believe in spirits or fate or any such nonsense. She was a practical woman, raised on reason and logic. Yet she had also been raised to recognize truth when it presented itself. And there was something undeniably true about the connection she felt to Garrett Quinn. Winter Moon settled herself on a low stool near the fire and pulled out a basket filled with what appeared to be dried herbs and roots. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she sorted through them, setting some aside and returning others to the basket. Tell me about your life in St. Louis, the old woman said. What brought you to these wild mountains? Grateful for the change of subject, Violet began to talk. She spoke of her childhood, of parents who had loved her fiercely and encouraged her curious mind. She spoke of the fever that had swept through their neighborhood like a scythe through wheat, taking both her mother and father within days of each other. She spoke of the suffocating grief that had followed, the way her aunt and uncle's small house had felt like a cage, and the desperate longing for something more, something different, that had eventually brought her west. Winter Moon listened without interruption, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the fire. When Violet finally fell silent, her voice growing hoarse from so much talking, the old woman nodded slowly. "You are a seeker," she said simply. "You search for your place in this world, for the purpose that will give your life meaning. This is a good thing, but it is also dangerous. Seekers often wander into trouble because they are looking ahead instead of watching their feet. Hence the rattlesnake." "Hence the rattlesnake," Winter Moon agreed. "But also hence Garrett Quinn. Sometimes trouble is simply the path to where we are meant to be." Before Violet could respond to this cryptic statement, the door opened and Garrett ducked back inside. His hair was wet and slicked back from his face, and he had changed into a clean shirt that did nothing to hide the powerful muscles of his chest and arms. Violet found herself staring and quickly looked away, but not before she caught the flash of amusement in Winter Moon's eyes. "There is rabbit cooking over the outdoor fire," Garrett said, addressing Winter Moon. "It should be ready soon." "Good. We could all use a proper meal. Violet, do you think you could manage some solid food?" "I think so. The broth has helped tremendously." As if to prove her point, Violet tried once more to sit up. This time, though the world still tilted slightly, it did not spin quite so violently as before. Garrett was at her side in an instant, his large hand supporting her back as she maneuvered herself into a sitting position. His touch was warm even through the fabric of her dress, and Violet was acutely aware of how improper this all was, being alone with a strange man and accepting his help with such intimate matters. But propriety seemed like a distant concern, something belonging to the civilized world of St. Louis rather than these wild mountains. Here, survival took precedence over social niceties, and Violet found she did not mind nearly as much as she probably should have. "Thank you," she murmured, meeting his eyes. Up close, she could see that they were not simply gray but flecked with silver and blue, like storm clouds shot through with lightning. "You are welcome." He held her gaze for a long moment, and Violet felt as though he was seeing straight through to her very soul, reading all the secrets and fears and longings she kept hidden from the world. Winter Moon cleared her throat pointedly, and they both looked away, Garrett moving back toward the door while Violet focused intently on arranging the furs around her legs. The meal, when it came, was simple but delicious. The rabbit had been seasoned with wild herbs and roasted until the meat fell from the bones, and Winter Moon served it with flatbread made from cornmeal and honey. Violet ate slowly, mindful of her still unsettled stomach, but she managed to finish everything on her plate. Food had never tasted quite so good as it did after coming so close to death. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional night bird calling from the forest outside. Violet found herself watching Garrett when she thought he was not paying attention, studying the way the firelight played across his strong features, the way his hands handled his food with surprising delicacy, despite their size and obvious strength. He caught her looking once, and instead of turning away, Violet held his gaze. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his rough features into something almost boyish. She smiled back, feeling suddenly shy and bold all at once. "You should rest now," Winter Moon said, breaking the spell. Tomorrow will be soon enough for talking and getting to know one another better. Tonight, your body needs sleep." Violet wanted to protest, wanted to stay up and learn more about this mysterious mountain man who had saved her life. But her eyelids were already growing heavy, and she could feel exhaustion pulling at her limbs like a physical weight. "Where will you sleep?" she asked Garrett as Winter Moon helped her lie back down on the furs. "Outside. I prefer it. Even in a storm. Especially in a storm." He stood and stretched, his body unfolding to its full impressive height. "Sleep well, Violet Grayson. I will be close by if you need anything. How will I call for you? I will hear you, I promise." And somehow Violet believed him. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, her last conscious thought being of steel-gray eyes and a smile that made her heart beat faster than any venom ever could. She woke twice during the night, once to find Winter Moon tending the fire and once to the sound of a wolf howling somewhere in the distance. Both times, she felt a deep sense of peace, of being exactly where she was meant to be. It was a strange feeling for someone who had spent the last 3 years feeling adrift and purposeless, but Violet did not question it. She simply let it wash over her and carry her back into dreams. Morning came with golden light streaming through the gaps in the cabin walls, and the smell of coffee brewing over the fire. Violet opened her eyes to find Winter Moon already up and moving about, her movements efficient and unhurried. There was no sign of Garrett, and Violet felt a small pang of disappointment before she caught herself. What was wrong with her? She had known this man for less than a day. She had no claim on him, no right to miss his presence. "He has gone hunting," Winter Moon said without turning around, as if she had read Violet's thoughts. "He will return before midday." Violet sat up carefully, pleased to find that her head remained clear, and the nausea from yesterday had faded to nothing more than a faint queasiness. Her ankle was sore and swollen, but the pain was manageable, nothing like the agony of the venom spreading through her system. "How do you feel?" Winter Moon asked, bringing over a cup of what smelled like herbal tea. "Much better. Weak but better. Good. Drink this. It will help flush the last of the poison from your blood and give you strength." The tea was bitter but not unpleasant, with undertones of mint and something else Violet could not identify. She drank it all, then accepted the cornmeal mush Winter Moon offered for breakfast. As she ate, the old woman examined her ankle, prodding gently at the swollen flesh and nodding with satisfaction. "The healing is progressing well. You were very lucky, child. That was a large rattlesnake, and it delivered a full dose of venom. Most people would not have survived, even with treatment. Because Garrett extracted some of it. That, and because you are strong, strength of body and strength of will, both are necessary to survive in this land." After breakfast, Winter Moon helped Violet outside to relieve herself and wash. The cabin was situated in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and aspens, with a stream running nearby that sang over smooth stones. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and wildflowers, and Violet breathed deeply, feeling more alive than she had in months. "This place is beautiful," she said, looking around at the wilderness that pressed in from all sides. "Do you live here alone?" "Most of the time, yes. Garrett visits when he is in the area, and occasionally others come seeking my medicines or my advice, but I prefer the solitude. I have lived among people and found them wanting. That seems lonely. Loneliness is not the same as being alone. I have the forest, the animals, the spirits of my ancestors. That is company enough." Winter Moon's eyes, sharp despite her years, studied Violet intently. "But you are not built for solitude, I think. You need people, need connection. It is why you agreed to come west with your aunt and uncle despite your grief. You were hoping to find your tribe." "My tribe?" the people who understand you, who accept you as you are. Everyone has a tribe, whether it is family or friends or something else entirely. Yours has simply been scattered, and you are searching for it. Violet considered this as Winter Moon helped her back inside and settled her on the furs. There was truth in the old woman's words. She had always felt slightly out of step with the world around her, as if everyone else had been given a script that she had somehow missed. Her parents had understood her, had nurtured her curious mind and encouraged her questions. But after their deaths, she had felt adrift, unable to connect with her well-meaning but conventional aunt and uncle, unable to find her place in the rigid social structure of St. Louis society. "You think I will find it here?" she asked quietly. "My tribe, I mean." Winter Moon smiled. "I think you have already begun to find it, but that is not for me to say. That is something you must discover for yourself." They spent the morning in quiet companionship. Winter Moon teaching Violet about the various herbs and plants she used in her medicines, while Violet listened with rapt attention. It was fascinating, the wealth of knowledge the old woman possessed, accumulated over a lifetime of observation and experimentation. Violet found herself wishing she had paper and pen to record it all, but she made do with committing as much as possible to memory. True to Winter Moon's prediction, Garrett returned just before midday with a brace of rabbits and several fish from the stream. He nodded to both women but said nothing, simply set about cleaning and preparing his catch with practiced efficiency. Violet watched him work, admiring the economical grace of his movements, the way his strong hands handled the knife with such precision. He caught her watching and raised an eyebrow in question. Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks, but refused to look away. "You are very skilled," she said, breaking the silence. "It comes from necessity. When you live in the wilderness, you learn quickly or you starve." "How long have you lived this way?" Garrett paused in his work, considering. 16 years, give or take." "Since I was 12, and the trapper who found me decided I was civilized enough to be left on my own." "You were only 12 years old and living alone in these mountains." "I was not alone. I had the wolves, the elk, the bears, better company than most humans if you ask me." "That is a terrible thing to say." "Is it? Most humans I have met are selfish, cruel, or stupid. Often all three. Animals are honest. They kill when they are hungry or threatened, not out of spite or greed. They do not lie or betray. They do not take more than they need." Winter Moon, who had been listening to this exchange with apparent amusement, spoke up. "You are painting with a very broad brush, Garrett Quinn. What about me? Am I selfish, cruel, and stupid? You are the exception that proves the rule. And what about this girl you risked your life to save? Is she selfish and cruel?" Garrett's eyes found Violet's and something passed between them, something electric and undefined. "No," he said softly. "She is different." "Then perhaps you should revise your opinion of humanity. If one person can be good, then others can be as well. You have simply been unfortunate in those you have encountered." "Perhaps." But he did not sound convinced. Lunch was fish roasted over the fire with wild onions and some sort of root vegetable that tasted similar to a potato. As they ate, Violet gathered her courage and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since yesterday. "Will you truly ride into Leadville to inform my aunt and uncle that I am safe?" "I said I would, did I not?" "Yes, but that is a long journey to undertake for people you do not know." Garrett set down his plate and leaned back against the cabin wall, his long legs stretched out before him. "I do not like towns. Too many people, too much noise. But I will go because it is the right thing to do and because I gave you my word. A man who does not keep his word is not worth much in my estimation. Will you bring them back here? If they wish to come, yes. The Winter Moon's hospitality only extends so far, and this cabin is not equipped to house a family reunion. They can make camp nearby, Winter Moon interjected. There is good ground by the stream, sheltered from the wind. Violet needs another day or two of rest before she should attempt the journey back to Leadville, so they will have to wait regardless. Or I could simply ride in with Garrett and save everyone the trouble, Violet suggested. Both Winter Moon and Garrett responded simultaneously with a firm no. Violet bristled. I am perfectly capable of deciding what I can and cannot do. Are you? Winter Moon's voice was mild, but her eyes were sharp. Stand up then. Walk to the door and back. Violet opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She knew the old woman was right. Her ankle was still swollen and tender, and she had barely managed the short walk outside this morning. A 10-mile journey on horseback would be excruciating, possibly dangerous if the wound reopened or became infected. Fine, she said, crossing her arms over her chest. I will wait, but I do not have to be happy about it. No one asked you to be happy about it, Garrett said, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. Just to be sensible. I am always sensible, says the woman who wandered away from a wagon trail to pick berries in Rattlesnake country. Violet glared at him, but there was no real heat in it. He was right, after all. She had been foolish, and she had very nearly paid for that foolishness with her life. Still, she did not appreciate having her nose rubbed in it. I have learned my lesson, I assure you. From now on, I will be the very picture of caution and wisdom. I will believe that when I see it. Garrett stood and brushed off his pants. I should leave soon if I am going to reach Leadville before dark. Winter Moon, do you need anything from town? The old woman considered. Salt, if you can manage it, and needles, the small ones for fine work. Mine are growing dull. I will see what I can do. He turned to Violet, and his expression softened. I will tell your aunt and uncle you are safe and well cared for. Is there anything specific you want me to say? Just that I am sorry for worrying them, and that I will return as soon as I am able. Done. He paused as if he wanted to say something more, but then seemed to think better of it. With a nod to both women, he strode out of the cabin and disappeared into the forest. Violet found herself staring at the empty doorway long after he had gone, a strange hollow feeling in her chest. It was absurd, really. She barely knew the man, yet his absence seemed to drain the color from the world, leaving everything slightly dull and lifeless. He will be back tomorrow, Winter Moon said gently. You need not look so forlorn. I do not know what you mean. Child, I am old, not blind. You care for him already and he for you. There is no shame in that. The heart knows what it wants, regardless of what the head might say. Violet wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that Winter Moon was seeing things that were not there. But the words stuck in her throat, because they would have been a lie. She did care for Garrett Quinn, this strange, wild man who lived more like a beast than a human. She cared for him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying, a way that made her feel alive and vulnerable all at once. It is too soon, she said quietly. I have known him less than 2 days. Time is not the measure of connection. I knew my husband for only 3 days before I agreed to marry him. We had 45 years together before he passed into the spirit world. Some people you know instantly, in your bones and blood. Garrett is such a person for you. How can you be so certain? Because I see the way you both come alive in each other's presence. Because I know that fate does not bring people together without reason. And because I am old and wise and you should listen to me. Despite herself, Violet laughed. There was something refreshing about Winter Moon's directness, her refusal to dance around uncomfortable truths. It was so different from the carefully polite society Violet had known in St. Louis, where everyone said one thing and meant another. What if he does not feel the same way? The question slipped out before Violet could stop it, revealing her deepest fear. Then you will be hurt, and you will heal, and you will go on. But I do not think that will be the case. I have known Garrett since he was a boy, wild and broken and angry at the world. I have never seen him look at another person the way he looks at you, not once in all these years. He looks at me like I am a wounded animal he feels obliged to care for. If that is what you think, then you are not paying attention. He looks at you like you are the sun, and he has been living in darkness for too long. The words sent a shiver down Violet's spine, equal parts fear and exhilaration. Could it be true? Could this strong, solitary man truly care for her after such a brief acquaintance? It seemed impossible, the stuff of the romantic novels she had read as a girl. Yet when she thought of the way he had held her, the urgency in his voice when he commanded her to stay with him, the softness in his eyes when he smiled at her across the fire, she could not help but hope. The afternoon passed slowly. Violet tried to occupy herself by watching Winter Moon work and asking questions about the various herbs and remedies the old woman prepared. But her mind kept wandering to Garrett, imagining him riding through the forest toward Leadville, wondering what he was thinking, whether he was thinking of her at all. She must have dozed off at some point, because she woke to find the cabin dim with twilight and Winter Moon lighting candles around the room. The old woman glanced over and smiled. You needed the rest. Healing takes energy, and your body is still recovering. I feel much better. And it was true. The weakness that had plagued her all day had receded, leaving her feeling almost normal if still sore and stiff. Good. Tomorrow you should try walking a bit, build your strength. But for now, more rest is best. They ate a simple dinner of leftover rabbit and vegetables. Then Winter Moon told stories of her youth, of her people who had once roamed these mountains freely before the white settlers came and pushed them onto ever-shrinking parcels of land. There was sadness in her voice, but also a fierce pride, a refusal to let her heritage be forgotten or diminished. Violet listened with rapt attention, painfully aware of her own role as one of those white settlers, one of the people who had taken without thought for those who had been here first. It was uncomfortable, confronting these truths, but necessary. She had come west seeking something new, something different, but she was beginning to understand that she could not simply escape the injustices of the world. They were everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the society she was part of. I am sorry, she said quietly when Winter Moon finished a particularly poignant story about her grandmother, who had died on the forced march to the reservation. For what my people have done to yours. Winter Moon regarded her with those penetrating dark eyes. Your sorrow changes nothing, but it is appreciated nonetheless. What matters now is what you do with the knowledge you have gained. Will you turn away, pretend ignorance because it is easier? Or will you stand as witness to the truth, carry it with you, let it shape how you move through the world? I do not know. I am just one person. What difference can I make? Every river starts with a single drop of water. Never underestimate the power of one person who chooses to do right instead of wrong. They settled in for the night, Violet wrapped in warm furs and Winter Moon on a pallet near the fire. As she drifted toward sleep, Violet thought about the old woman's words, about rivers and drops of water and the power of individual choice. She had come west seeking her place in the world, seeking her tribe. Perhaps she had found more than that. Perhaps she had found a purpose. The sound of footsteps outside the cabin woke her sometime in the darkest part of the night. Violet tensed, her heart suddenly racing, but then she heard Garrett's low voice speaking softly to Winter Moon. Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. He had returned. He was safe. She kept her eyes closed, not wanting to intrude on their conversation, but she could not help listening as Garrett reported on his journey to Leadville. I found the Graysons at the boarding house where they are staying while they prepare to open their store. They were frantic with worry, had gathered a search party to go looking for Violet at first light. I told them she was safe and recovering from a snake bite, that they could come here tomorrow to see her. How did they react? Wintermoon asked. The aunt cried. The uncle wanted to know every detail of what happened. I told them as much as they needed to know, left out the parts that would only frighten them more. They will come tomorrow afternoon with a wagon, so Violet can ride back in comfort when you deem her ready to travel. Good. That is good. There was a pause, and then Garrett asked quietly, how is she? Truly, healing well. Her body is strong and her spirit stronger. She will make a full recovery. And after, when she returns to Leadville and her family, that is not for me to say. But I think perhaps you should ask her yourself, rather than wondering in silence. Another pause, longer this time. I do not know what to say to her. I do not know how to talk to people, not like regular folks do. In the mountains, I can track an elk for days, can read the wind and sky like a book. But this, I am lost. Violet's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his voice, this strong man admitting his weakness. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him that he did not need fancy words, that his actions had already spoken volumes. But she remained still and silent, sensing that this was not her moment to intrude. Then do not talk, Wintermoon said simply. Show her. Take her into the forest tomorrow if she is strong enough. Let her see the world you love, the world you inhabit. Sometimes the best way to know a person is to see them in their element. You think she would want that, after what happened? I think she is braver than you give her credit for. She reminds me of myself at that age, full of fire and questions, and a refusal to accept the world as it is handed to her. Yes, I think she would very much want that. Violet heard movement, the soft sound of Garrett settling down near the door. She waited for more conversation, but none came. Gradually, the cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of its occupants. She lay awake for a long time, thinking about what she had overheard, her mind spinning with possibilities and hopes she barely dared to acknowledge. Morning came too slowly and too quickly all at once. Violet woke to find Wintermoon already up and Garrett nowhere to be seen, though his pack was still by the door, indicating he had not gone far. She ate the breakfast Wintermoon provided, then carefully stood and tested her weight on her injured ankle. It hurt, but it was a manageable pain, nothing like the agony of 2 days ago. She took a few tentative steps, pleased when her leg held firm beneath her. By the time Garrett returned from wherever he had gone, Violet was walking slow circles around the cabin, rebuilding her strength and confidence. You heal fast, he observed, watching her with those intense gray eyes. I have always been resilient. My mother used to say I was half mountain goat, the way I bounced back from injuries and illnesses that would lay other children low. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. I miss her every day. They stood in silence for a moment, and Violet could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. She thought of what she had overheard last night, Garrett's admission that he did not know how to talk to her. Well, perhaps they could stumble through this together. Wintermoon suggested you might take me into the forest today if I am feeling up to it, she said, deciding to be direct. To see your world. Garrett's eyebrows rose in surprise. Did she now? She did. And I would very much like to go if you are willing. It will not be easy. The terrain is rough, and you are still recovering. I can manage. I want to see what you see, understand what draws you to live this way. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her determination against her physical limitations. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "All right. But we go slowly, and if you need to rest or turn back, you say so immediately." "Agreed." "Agreed." They set out shortly after, Violet wearing a pair of soft boots Winter Moon had provided to replace her ruined shoes. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Garrett set a measured pace, checking frequently to make sure Violet was keeping up, ready to assist if she stumbled. But Violet was determined to prove her strength, and she pushed through the discomfort in her ankle, focusing instead on the beauty surrounding her. The forest was alive with movement and sound. Birds calling from the canopy, squirrels chattering as they leaped from branch to branch, the distant sound of water rushing over stones. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden shafts, illuminating patches of wildflowers and making the whole world seem touched by magic. Garrett led her to a high ridge that looked out over a valley filled with aspens, their leaves shimmering silver green in the morning light. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "This is beautiful," Violet breathed, transfixed by the view. "This is home," Garrett replied simply. "This is where I belong." She turned to look at him and found him watching not the landscape but her, his expression unguarded for once. In that moment, she saw him fully. Not just the mountain man, not just the rescuer, but a man who had been hurt deeply and had retreated into solitude to heal. A man who had found peace in the wilderness but who still yearned, whether he admitted it or not, for human connection. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said softly. "For trusting me with this. Thank you for wanting to see it." Most people look at the wilderness and see only danger, only hardship. They do not see the beauty, the freedom. "I see it." And she did. Standing here with the wind in her hair and the vast expanse of mountains stretching to the horizon, Violet felt something shift inside her. This was what she had been seeking without knowing it. Not just space and solitude, but wildness. The chance to shed the constraints of civilization and discover who she truly was beneath all the expectations and proprieties. "Tell me about the wolves," she said, settling herself on a sun-warmed rock. "The ones who raised you." Garrett hesitated, then sat beside her, his large frame making the boulder seem smaller. "It is hard to put into words. When the trapper found me, I could barely speak English anymore. I had forgotten how to be human. The wolves had taught me their language instead, body posture, scent, the subtle movements of ears and tail. I knew how to hunt in a pack, how to show submission or dominance, how to howl to call my family home. That must have been terrifying, learning to be human again. It was, and it was lonely. The wolves never judged me, never expected me to be anything other than what I was. But people, they had all these rules, these expectations. I did not understand them. I still do not, most of the time." "Is that why you prefer to live alone?" "Partly. But also because out here, I can be myself without apology. I do not have to pretend to be civilized, do not have to force myself into a mold that was never meant to fit me." Violet understood that feeling more than she could say. She had spent years trying to be the proper young lady her aunt and uncle expected, trying to fit into a society that felt fundamentally wrong to her. It had been exhausting, soul-crushing work. "What if you did not have to choose?" she asked quietly. "What if you could have both the wilderness and human connection?" Garrett turned to her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Is that possible? I do not know, but I would like to find out." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and unspoken desire. Garrett lifted his hand, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair back from Violet's face. His touch was feather-light, reverent, as if he was afraid she might shatter. "I have never met anyone like you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. You should be terrified of me, should see me as nothing more than a savage, but you look at me like I am worth knowing. You are worth knowing. More than that, you are extraordinary. You saved my life, Garrett. You carried me 3 miles through rough terrain, stayed by my side while I recovered, rode 10 miles just to ease my family's worries. Those are not the actions of a savage. Those are the actions of a good man. I am not good. I have done things, violent things, to survive. So has everyone who lives in this land. That does not make you evil, it makes you human. He looked away, jaw tight with some internal struggle. Violet took a chance and reached for his hand, lacing her smaller fingers through his larger ones. He stiffened at the contact, then relaxed, his grip gentle despite his obvious strength. I do not know what I am doing, he admitted. I do not know how to court a woman, how to say the pretty words she deserves to hear. I do not need pretty words, I just need honesty. Then here is my honesty. He turned back to her, and his eyes were blazing with an emotion so intense it stole her breath. From the moment I first saw you, lying in those berry bushes with fear and determination warring on your face, I felt something shift inside me. It was like waking up from a long sleep, like the world suddenly had color again. I do not understand it, cannot explain it, but I know that I do not want to let you go. I know that the thought of you leaving, of going back to Leadville and disappearing from my life, makes me feel like I am being torn in half. Tears pricked at Violet's eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. I do not want to leave either. I do not want to go back to pretending to be someone I am not, to living a life that feels like a cage. I want this. I want the mountains and the freedom and you. Your family will not understand. They will think I am taking advantage of you, corrupting you. Then I will make them understand. Or I will not, and I will choose this anyway. I am 19 years old, Garrett, old enough to make my own decisions about my life and my future. It will not be easy. Life in the wilderness never is. I do not want easy, I want real, I want to feel alive. You feel alive to me. He raised their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. You make me feel alive too. They sat together on that sun-warmed rock for a long time, hands clasped and shoulders touching, looking out over the valley and speaking in quiet voices about their hopes and fears and dreams. Violet told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about the books she loved and the questions that kept her awake at night. Garrett told her about the wolves, about the lessons they had taught him in patience and loyalty and living in the present moment. It was the most intimate conversation Violet had ever had with anyone, more revealing than all the carefully polite exchanges she had endured at dinner parties and social gatherings. This was what she had been seeking all along, someone who would listen without judgment, who would share their true self without fear or pretense. The sun was high overhead when they finally made their way back to Winter Moon's cabin. Violet's ankle was throbbing by the end, and she leaned heavily on Garrett's arm, but she felt lighter than she had in years. Something fundamental had changed between them, a bond forged that went deeper than mere attraction or gratitude. Winter Moon took one look at their joined hands and their radiant faces and smiled. I see the forest was instructive. You knew, Violet accused, but there was no heat in her voice. I am old and wise, child. Of course I knew. Now come sit. Your family will be here soon, and you should be rested when they arrive. True to Winter Moon's prediction, Violet's aunt and uncle arrived in the early afternoon, riding in a sturdy wagon driven by a grizzled man who Winter Moon greeted by name. Aunt Martha leaped down before the wagon had fully stopped and rushed to Violet, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "Thank God you are all right," she said, her voice thick with tears. "When you did not return, when we searched and could not find you, I thought the worst. I thought we had lost you like we lost your parents. I am fine, Aunt Martha. Truly. Thanks to Garrett and Winter Moon, I am going to be perfectly fine. Uncle Joseph was more reserved, but Violet could see the relief in his eyes as he looked her over, checking for himself that she was indeed whole and well. He turned to Garrett and extended his hand. Mr. Quinn, we owe you a debt we can never repay. You saved our niece's life. Garrett shook his hand briefly, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, Uncle Joseph said firmly. Not everyone would have had the skill to extract the venom, or the strength to carry her so far, or the kindness to ride all the way to Leadville to ease our minds. You are a good man, sir, and we are forever in your debt. Aunt Martha, meanwhile, had turned her attention to Winter Moon, thanking the old woman profusely for her care and healing. Winter Moon accepted the thanks with grace, but waved away the offer of payment. I did what anyone with knowledge would do. But if you truly wish to repay me, remember this. The old ways have value. The medicines of my people have kept us alive for thousands of years. Do not dismiss them simply because they are not taught in your schools. I will not forget, Aunt Martha promised. Violet, are you well enough to travel? We have made the wagon as comfortable as possible. Violet glanced at Garrett, saw the carefully controlled expression on his face, and made her decision. Actually, I was hoping to stay another day or two, just to make sure I am fully recovered before attempting the journey. Aunt Martha frowned. Are you certain? We have been so worried, and the boarding house is much more comfortable than— She stopped herself, clearly realizing that criticizing Winter Moon's hospitality would be incredibly rude. I am certain, Violet said firmly, and I promise I will return to Leadville very soon. But I need a bit more time. Uncle Joseph and Aunt Martha exchanged glances, a whole conversation passing between them in silence. Finally, Uncle Joseph nodded. Very well, but we will return in 2 days to collect you. And Mr. Quinn, might we impose upon you to keep watch over her in the meantime? I know she is in good hands with Winter Moon, but it would ease our minds to know there is someone nearby who can handle any further emergencies. I will stay, Garrett said without hesitation. You have my word she will be safe. After extracting promises from Violet to rest and not do anything foolish, Aunt Martha and Uncle Joseph reluctantly departed. Violet watched the wagon disappear into the forest, feeling equal parts guilt and relief. She loved her aunt and uncle, truly she did. But they represented the life she was trying to leave behind, and she was not ready to return to it yet. That was brave, Winter Moon observed, and possibly foolish. They will not be happy when they learn what you are planning. How do you know what I am planning? Because I am old and wise, and I see the way you look at Garrett Quinn. You are planning to stay, to learn the ways of the wilderness, to build a life here. Am I wrong? Violet looked at Garrett, who was watching her with an expression of hope and fear warring on his face. No, she said softly. You are not wrong. Then we have much work to do, Winter Moon said briskly. You cannot survive in the mountains on determination alone. You need skills, knowledge, practical abilities, and you need to learn them quickly before the snow comes and makes travel impossible. What followed were 2 of the most intense and exhausting days of Violet's life. Winter Moon was a demanding teacher, expecting perfect attention and quick learning. She taught Violet how to identify edible plants and which ones to avoid, how to build a fire without matches, how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals, how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the creatures that lived there. Garrett supplemented these lessons with his own brand of teaching, showing Violet how to track animals by their prints and scat, how to fish using only a sharpened stick and patience, how to navigate using the sun and stars. He was patient with her mistakes but firm in his corrections, making it clear that out here, errors could mean death. But there were softer moments too. Evenings spent by the fire, Garrett's arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge one by one. Early mornings, when he would wake her before dawn to see the elk grazing in the meadow, their breath misting in the cold air. Stolen kisses when winter moon's back was turned, sweet and tentative and full of promise. On the second evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Garrett took both of Violet's hands in his. "Tomorrow your aunt and uncle return," he said quietly. "You need to decide what you want to tell them. I want to tell them the truth. That I am staying here with you, that I am going to learn to live in these mountains. They will not understand. They will try to convince you to return to Leadville to live a proper life. Then I will have to make them understand that this is my proper life. That I have never felt more myself than I do here with you. Violet." Her name was a prayer on his lips. "Are you certain? Because once you make this choice, there is no going back. You cannot simply decide in a few months that you miss civilization and return to your old life. The wilderness does not work that way. I am certain. I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then I will stand beside you when you tell them. And I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision. I could never regret choosing you," she whispered. "Never." Their kiss was deep and thorough, full of promise and passion and a tenderness that made Violet's eyes sting with tears. This was right. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just a place, but a person. Not just freedom, but love. When Aunt Martha and Uncle Joseph arrived the next afternoon, they found Violet waiting for them with Garrett at her side and Winter Moon standing slightly behind, a silent witness to whatever drama was about to unfold. "Violet, gather your things," Aunt Martha said, bustling forward. "We have fresh clothes for you in the wagon, and there is a hot bath waiting at the boarding house. Aunt Martha, Uncle Joseph, I need to speak with you. Please sit down." Something in Violet's tone must have warned them, because they both froze. Uncle Joseph's expression grew wary. "What is this about? I am not returning to Leadville with you. Not today and not in the foreseeable future. I am staying here in the mountains with Garrett." The silence that followed was deafening. Aunt Martha's face went white, then red. "Absolutely not. I will not allow it. Violet, you have been through a terrible ordeal and you are not thinking clearly. This man, this wilderness creature, he has taken advantage of your vulnerability." "That is not true," Violet said firmly. "Garrett has been nothing but respectful and honorable. I am making this decision of my own free will, with a clear mind and open eyes." "You have known him for 3 days," Uncle Joseph pointed out, his voice strained. 3 days, Violet. That is not enough time to make a decision that will affect your entire life. Perhaps not in the city, where people court for months or years before committing to one another. But out here, time moves differently. I know Garrett Quinn in ways that matter, ways that go deeper than polite conversation over tea. I know his character, his strength, his goodness. And I know that I love him." The words hung in the air, bold and irrevocable. Violet had not planned to say them, had not even fully admitted them to herself until this moment. But now that they were out, she felt nothing but rightness, certainty settling over her like a warm blanket. Garrett's hand found hers, squeezing gently. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and calm. "Mr. and Mrs. Grayson, I understand your concerns. From your perspective, I am a stranger asking you to entrust your niece's life and future to me. But I give you my word, my sacred vow, that I will protect her with my life. I will teach her everything she needs to know to survive and thrive in this environment. and I will love her with everything I have, for as long as I draw breath." "This is madness," Aunt Martha said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "Violet, please, think about what you are giving up. A comfortable home, a place in society, the chance to marry well and raise a family in safety." "I have thought about it, Aunt Martha. I have thought about little else. And I realize now that I do not want those things, not in the way you mean them. I want a different kind of life, one built on honesty and freedom and connection to the land. I want to marry Garrett if he will have me, and I want to build a future here in these mountains. If I will have you." Garrett turned to her, his gray eyes blazing. "Violet Grayson, I would count myself the most fortunate man alive if you would consent to be my wife." "Then I consent." She was crying now, happy tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Garrett, 1,000 times yes." They kissed, heedless of the audience, and when they finally broke apart, Violet found her aunt dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief while Uncle Joseph looked torn between frustration and resignation. "This is highly irregular," Uncle Joseph said. "There are proprieties to consider, arrangements to be made." "We can arrange whatever you feel is necessary," Garrett said. "But understand this. Violet is staying with me whether you give your blessing or not. I would prefer to have your approval for her sake, but I will not let her go." Uncle Joseph studied Garrett for a long moment, then turned to Winter Moon, who had been watching the proceedings with quiet amusement. "What do you think of all this?" "I think these two are meant for each other," the old woman said simply. "I think they will be happy in a way that most people never experience. And I think you should give them your blessing, because they are going to do this regardless, and it would be better for all concerned if they had family support." Aunt Martha let out a long, shuddering breath. "I do not understand this, any of it, but I can see that you are determined, Violet, and I suppose if you must insist on throwing your life away on a man you barely know, at least he seems decent enough. God knows he saved your life." "Is that a blessing?" Violet asked hopefully. "It is as close to one as you are likely to get from me today." Aunt Martha managed a watery smile. "But I reserve the right to say I told you so if this all goes horribly wrong." "Duly noted." Violet hugged her aunt fiercely. Thank you for understanding, or at least for trying to." Uncle Joseph cleared his throat. "If you are going to live out here, you will need supplies. Tools, blankets, food stores for the winter. I will provide them as my wedding gift to you both. And I expect regular visits, young lady. Just because you are abandoning civilization does not mean you can abandon your family." "I would never," Violet promised. "We will visit as often as we can." What followed was a flurry of practical discussions about what Violet would need, where she and Garrett would live, how they would manage during the harsh Colorado winters. Winter Moon offered the use of her cabin until Garrett could build one of his own, and Garrett outlined his plans for a small homestead in a valley he had scouted several years prior. By the time Aunt Martha and Uncle Joseph departed, there was an understanding in place, if not quite full acceptance. They would return in a week with supplies and whatever of Violet's possessions she wanted brought from Leadville. In the meantime, Violet would remain with Winter Moon, continuing her education in wilderness survival, while Garrett began work on their future home. As the wagon disappeared into the trees, Violet leaned against Garrett's solid warmth and let out a long breath. "That went better than I feared." "They love you," Garrett said. "They just want you to be safe and happy. I am both of those things. For the first time in my life, I truly am." The following weeks passed in a blur of activity and learning. Garrett and Violet worked from dawn until dusk, clearing land for the cabin, felling trees and stripping logs, digging a foundation into the rocky soil. It was back-breaking work, but Violet threw herself into it with fierce determination. She was building her future with her own hands, and there was a deep satisfaction in that. Winter Moon continued to teach her the skills she would need: how to preserve meat for the winter, how to tan hides for clothing and blankets, how to make candles from rendered fat and soap from ash and lye. Violet absorbed it all like a sponge, her quick mind and natural curiosity serving her well. In the evenings, when the work was done and her muscles ached with exertion, Garrett would sit with her and teach her other things: the language of the wolves, the names of the stars, the stories of the mountains that had been passed down through generations of trappers and natives. And always, there was the growing intimacy between them, the stolen kisses that grew longer and more heated, the nights they spent curled together under the stars, talking until sleep finally claimed them. Uncle Joseph returned as promised, bringing a wagon loaded with supplies: tools and nails, bolts of cloth and thread, sacks of flour and sugar and coffee, blankets and cooking pots, and everything they might need to establish a household. He also brought Father Morrison, the priest from Leadville, to perform the marriage ceremony. The wedding took place in the clearing where their cabin was taking shape, with Winter Moon and Uncle Joseph and Aunt Martha as witnesses. Violet wore a simple dress of green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair loose around her shoulders and woven with wildflowers. Garrett had trimmed his beard and pulled his hair back, and he wore clean buckskins that emphasized the powerful lines of his body. Father Morrison seemed uncomfortable in the wilderness setting, constantly glancing around as if expecting wild animals to descend upon them at any moment. But he performed the ceremony with dignity, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Violet with a tenderness and passion that made Aunt Martha fan herself and Uncle Joseph clear his throat pointedly. They celebrated with a simple feast: roasted venison and wild vegetables, cornbread made in a skillet over the fire, and berry pie that Aunt Martha had brought from town. As the sun set and the stars emerged, Winter Moon sang a blessing in her native tongue, her voice rising and falling like the wind through the pines. When the Graysons finally departed, promising to return before the first snow, Violet and Garrett stood together in front of their half-finished cabin, husband and wife, ready to begin their life together. The cabin was completed by late August, a sturdy structure of hewn logs with a stone fireplace and real glass windows that Uncle Joseph had brought from Leadville. It was small but well built, with a sleeping loft and a root cellar for food storage. Garrett had positioned it to face south, maximizing sunlight and warmth during the long winter months ahead. They furnished it simply with a bed frame Garrett constructed, a table and chairs, shelves for their few possessions. Violet made curtains from the cloth her aunt had provided, and Winter Moon gifted them with several beautifully woven blankets. It was not much by the standards of civilization, but to Violet it was perfect. It was home. As autumn painted the aspens gold and the nights grew increasingly cold, they fell into a rhythm. Garrett hunted and trapped while Violet tended the cabin and prepared the game he brought home. She learned to scrape hides until they were soft as butter, to smoke meat until it would keep through the winter, to render fat and make tallow candles that would light their long evenings. Winter Moon visited regularly, checking on their progress and offering advice. She had become like a grandmother to Violet, and Violet treasured the hours they spent together, learning not just practical skills but stories and wisdom that had been passed down through countless generations. And through it all, through the hard work and the challenges and the gradual adaptation to a life so different from anything she had known, Violet's love for Garrett only grew deeper. She learned the rhythms of his body, the way his face softened when he looked at her, the quiet strength he brought to everything he did. He was patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise when she succeeded. He made her laugh with his dry observations and held her close when homesickness occasionally swept over her. Their physical relationship deepened as well, a natural progression of the emotional intimacy they shared. Garrett was a considerate lover, attentive to Violet's needs and responses, teaching her the language of pleasure with the same patience he brought to teaching her wilderness skills. Those nights in their marriage bed, wrapped in warm furs with the fire crackling nearby, were some of the happiest of Violet's life. The first snow came in early October, just a dusting that melted by midday. But it was a warning, and they redoubled their efforts to prepare for the harsh months ahead. They cut and stacked firewood until they had what Garrett estimated was enough to last through the winter. They sealed every crack in the cabin walls with mud and moss. They laid in stores of dried meat and vegetables, flour and coffee and sugar, all the things they could not hunt or gather. When Aunt Martha and Uncle Joseph made their final visit before the mountain passes became impassable, they were amazed by the transformation. Violet, who had left Leadville as a somewhat sheltered city girl, had become something else entirely. Her hands were calloused from work, her body lean and strong from constant physical activity. She moved with confidence through the wilderness, reading signs that would have been invisible to her just months before. "You look well," Aunt Martha said, hugging her niece tightly. "Different but well, happy." "I am happy," Violet confirmed. "Happier than I have ever been." "And you are certain you will be all right through the winter? It can be harsh up here, isolated." "We will be fine. We have everything we need, and Garrett has survived many winters in these mountains. He knows what he is doing." Uncle Joseph pulled Garrett aside for a private conversation that Violet pretended not to notice. She saw her uncle grip Garrett's hand firmly, saw the serious expressions on both their faces. Whatever was said seemed to satisfy Uncle Joseph, because when they returned, he was smiling. "Take care of her," he said simply. "Always," Garrett replied. They exchanged gifts, warm socks and mittens that Aunt Martha had knitted, a new rifle from Uncle Joseph, and jars of preserves and pickles that would add variety to their winter diet. In return, Violet gave them fine buckskin gloves she had made herself, and a beautiful wolf pelt that Garrett had trapped and she had tanned. When her aunt and uncle finally departed, promising to return as soon as the passes cleared in spring, Violet felt a twinge of sadness but no regret. This was her life now, her choice, and she embraced it fully. The winter that followed was indeed harsh, with snow falling thick and deep, transforming the world into an expanse of white silence. There were days when it was too cold to venture outside for more than brief trips to gather firewood or check the snares Garrett had set near the cabin. But Violet found she did not mind the isolation. She had Garrett, and that was enough. They spent long evenings by the fire, Garrett carving useful items from wood while Violet sewed or did beadwork, skills Winter Moon had taught her. They told each other stories, played simple games, and made love with a frequency and creativity that would have scandalized Aunt Martha. They were learning each other in the most fundamental ways, building a partnership that went deeper than mere romance. One particularly cold night in January, as they lay wrapped together beneath a mountain of firs, Violet told Garrett about a realization she had come to. "I used to think freedom meant being alone, making choices without having to consider anyone else. But that is not freedom at all. That is just loneliness dressed up in pretty words. True freedom is choosing who you want to be with, building a life together based on mutual respect and love." "That is what we have." Garrett kissed her forehead. "You are wiser than I am, do you know that? I spent 16 years alone in these mountains, convinced I was free, but I was just hiding. From people, from connection, from the possibility of being hurt again. Then you stumbled into my life with your basket of berries and your stubborn determination, and suddenly I understood the difference between solitude and freedom. Do you regret it, giving up your solitude? Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Violet Quinn. You make me want to be more than just a man who survives. You make me want to live. Spring came eventually, as it always does, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth. Garrett and Violet emerged from their cabin like bears from hibernation, blinking in the bright sunlight and marveling at having survived their first winter together. Winter Moon visited as soon as the trails were passable, bringing news from the wider world and checking to make sure they had both survived the isolation without going mad. She seemed satisfied with what she found, a couple even more in love than they had been in the fall, comfortable in their partnership and confident in their choices. "You have done well," she told them. "Many marriages do not survive that first winter in the wilderness. The isolation, the hardship, the constant proximity, it tests even the strongest bonds, but you two have only grown stronger." "We had a good teacher," Violet said, hugging the old woman. "Everything you taught me, every skill and lesson, it made all the difference. Knowledge is important, yes. But what you have built here goes deeper than knowledge. You have built trust, partnership, love. Those are the things that truly matter." Aunt Martha and Uncle Joseph came shortly after, bringing news that the general store was thriving and that Leadville continued to grow as more miners flooded into the area seeking silver. They invited Violet and Garrett to visit, to see the town and reconnect with civilization. To Violet's surprise, Garrett agreed. "It might be good to see how the world is changing," he said, "and to remind ourselves why we prefer the mountains." The visit to Leadville was eye-opening in ways Violet had not anticipated. The town had grown considerably in the months since she had left, new buildings springing up seemingly overnight, the population swelling with fortune seekers and those who profited from them. It was loud and crowded and chaotic, a far cry from the peaceful silence of the wilderness. They stayed 3 days, sleeping in the room above the general store and helping Uncle Joseph and Aunt Martha with various tasks. Violet enjoyed seeing her family again, catching up on their lives and sharing stories of her own experiences. But by the 3rd day, she was eager to return home. The noise and crowds that had once seemed normal now felt overwhelming, suffocating. Garrett felt it even more acutely. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats, the relief that washed over him when they finally left the town behind and headed back into the mountains. "I do not know how people live like that," he said as they climbed higher, the sounds of civilization fading behind them. Packed together like sardines, breathing each other's air, never a moment of true quiet or solitude. "Neither do I," Violet admitted. "Not anymore. I used to think I needed people, needed to be part of a community. But what I actually needed was just you and the mountains and the freedom to live according to our own rules. No regrets then. Not a single one." Summer brought a different kind of abundance. The meadows exploded with wildflowers, and the forest came alive with game. Violet's garden, carefully tended, produced vegetables that supplemented their diet of meat and foraged foods. They visited Winter Moon regularly, and occasionally other mountain men would stop by, drawn by smoke from their chimney or simply following trails that led past their cabin. Garrett was cautiously social with these visitors, and Violet learned much from listening to their stories and trading information about weather patterns, game movements, and the general state of the territory. She also learned that she and Garrett were something of an anomaly. Most mountain men remained solitary, and women were rare in the high country. "You are brave to live this way," one old trapper told her. "Most women would not last a season." "Perhaps most women are not given the chance," Violet replied. "Given the opportunity and proper teaching, I think many would thrive here, just as I have." It was a conversation that stuck with her, and one evening she broached the subject with Garrett. "What would you think about taking on an apprentice?" she asked. "Someone, perhaps a woman, who wants to learn wilderness skills but has no one to teach them." Garrett considered this. "It is not a bad idea. There are probably plenty of people, men and women both, who feel trapped by civilization but do not know how to escape it. We could help them, teach them what we know." "Not immediately," Violet said quickly. "I am not ready to share our home with strangers, not yet. But perhaps in a few years when we are more established." "In a few years," Garrett agreed. "I like the idea of passing on knowledge, creating a legacy beyond just our own survival." As summer faded into autumn, Violet began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses, always reliable, failed to arrive. Her breasts felt tender and swollen, and there was a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. She confided her suspicions to Winter Moon during one of the old woman's visits, and Winter Moon confirmed them with a knowing smile and a gentle examination. "You are with child," she said. "Due in the spring, I would guess. Does this please you?" "Yes," Violet said, surprised by the fierceness of her joy. "Yes, it pleases me very much." Telling Garrett was one of the sweetest moments of Violet's life. She waited until they were alone in their cabin, the autumn wind howling outside while they sat warm and safe before the fire. She took his large hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is a baby growing here," she said softly. "Our child, due next spring." For a moment Garrett simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, his face transformed with wonder and joy so pure it brought tears to Violet's eyes. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby. We are. Are you happy?" Happy does not begin to cover it. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with exquisite gentleness as if she might break. "I never thought I would have this. A wife, a home, a family. I thought I was destined to live and die alone in these mountains. But you changed everything, Violet. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other that," she corrected. "I was just as lost as you were before we found each other." That winter was easier than the first, partly because they knew what to expect, but mostly because they had the joy of the coming baby to sustain them through the dark months. Garrett became even more protective than usual, insisting that Violet rest frequently and taking on extra chores to spare her from heavy labor. Winter Moon visited as often as the weather allowed, checking on Violet's progress and teaching her what to expect during childbirth. "It will hurt," the old woman said bluntly. "Anyone who tells you otherwise is a liar. But women have been birthing babies since the beginning of time, and you are strong. You will manage." "I am not afraid," Violet said, though that was not entirely true. She was afraid, terrified actually, of the pain and the danger and the thousand things that could go wrong. But she was also excited, eager to meet this new person they had created, to see what combination of her traits and Garrett's would emerge. The baby came in early April, during a late spring snowstorm that kept Winter Moon trapped at their cabin for 3 days. Which was fortunate, because Violet went into labor on the second day, her water breaking as she stood at the stove preparing breakfast. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours. Garrett held Violet's hand through it all, his face pale with fear and worry but his presence steady and calming. Winter Moon moved with practiced efficiency, coaching Violet through the contractions, checking her progress, preparing the cabin for the birth. When the baby finally emerged, slippery and squalling, Winter Moon cleaned him quickly and placed him on Violet's chest. Him, a son. With a shock of dark hair and gray eyes that would, Winter Moon predicted, stay gray just like his father's. "He is perfect," Violet breathed, overwhelmed by the wave of love that crashed over her at the sight of this tiny person. "Garrett, look, we have a son." Garrett was staring at the baby with an expression of such awe and tenderness that Violet fell in love with him all over again. When he reached out to touch the baby's hand, those tiny fingers wrapped around his calloused one, and Garrett made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "What should we name him?" he asked. Violet considered. They had discussed names over the winter, but none had felt quite right. Now, looking at this perfect little person, one name rose to the surface. Gabriel, Gabriel Quinn. It means God is my strength. Gabriel, Garrett repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Gabriel Quinn. Welcome to the world, son." Those first weeks with Gabriel were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Violet had never been so tired in her life, waking every few hours to feed the insatiable baby. But she had also never been so happy. Their little family felt complete in a way she had not even known was missing. Garrett was a natural father, surprisingly gentle with the fragile infant despite his size and strength. He would walk the floor with Gabriel for hours when the baby was fussy, singing songs in a language Violet did not recognize, songs the wolves had taught him when he was young. And Gabriel would quiet, soothed by his father's deep voice and steady heartbeat. When Aunt Martha and Uncle Joseph visited that summer, they were enchanted by their great-nephew. Aunt Martha held Gabriel for hours, rocking him and singing lullabies, while Uncle Joseph looked on with a softness Violet had rarely seen in him. "You have built a good life here," Uncle Joseph said to Violet during a quiet moment. "I will admit I had my doubts, but seeing you now, seeing your family, I know you made the right choice." "Thank you," Violet said, meaning it. "That means more to me than you know." The years that followed were full and rich. Gabriel grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's gray eyes and his mother's curiosity, fearless in his exploration of the world around him. When he was 3, Violet gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, a serene baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world with wide hazel eyes. As the children grew, Violet and Garrett taught them the skills they would need to thrive in the wilderness. Gabriel learned to track and hunt with his father, while Grace showed an early aptitude for plant identification and healing, spending hours with Winter Moon learning the old woman's craft. But they also made sure the children were exposed to civilization. Regular visits to Leadville meant Gabriel and Grace learned to read and write, learned manners and social graces, learned that there was a world beyond the mountains. Violet was determined that her children would have choices, that they would not feel trapped by the life they were born into. When Gabriel turned 10, Violet and Garrett took him on his first extended hunt, a week-long trip deep into the high country. It was a rite of passage, a chance for father and son to bond without distraction. They returned with stories of elk and eagles, and Gabriel wore the confidence of growing maturity like a cloak. Grace followed 2 years later with her own rite of passage, a journey with Violet to gather rare medicinal plants that grew only in the highest meadows. Mother and daughter spent a week together under the stars, talking about everything and nothing, building the kind of relationship Violet had lost when her own mother died. Through it all, through the passage of seasons and years, Violet and Garrett's love only deepened. They had grown together, changed together, built a life from nothing but determination and hope. They were partners in the truest sense, each one complementing the other's strengths and compensating for the other's weaknesses. Winter Moon grew older, frailer, and finally passed away peacefully in her sleep when Gabriel was 12 and Grace was 9. They buried her in the clearing near her cabin, in the shadow of the mountains she had loved. Violet wept for the loss of this woman who had been teacher, friend, and grandmother, but she also felt grateful. Grateful for the years they had shared, grateful for the wisdom Winter Moon had passed on, grateful that the old woman had died at peace, surrounded by the beauty of the wilderness. Violet took over Winter Moon's role as healer for the scattered population of mountain folk, using the knowledge she had been taught to help those in need. Word spread, and people began to seek her out, making the journey to the Quinn cabin when they were sick or injured. She never turned anyone away, and she never asked for payment, though people usually left something anyway, furs or meat or simply their thanks. When Gabriel turned 18, he announced his intention to become a guide for wealthy Eastern tourists who wanted to experience the wilderness. It was a new industry, and Gabriel saw opportunity in it. Garrett was skeptical at first, but Violet encouraged their son to follow his dreams. "You taught him to love these mountains," she reminded Garrett. "Now let him share that love with others. It is a good thing." Grace, at 16, had different plans. She wanted to study medicine properly, to combine the old healing ways with the new knowledge being developed in universities back east. It would mean leaving the mountains for several years, and the thought broke Violet's heart. But she remembered her own need to forge her own path, and she gave her daughter her blessing. The day Grace departed for Denver to begin her studies, Violet stood with Garrett watching the wagon disappear into the distance. She was crying, unable to help herself. "She will come back," Garrett said, pulling her close. "These mountains are in her blood just as they are in ours. She will study and learn, and then she will return and she will do great things. I know, but I will miss her terribly. So will I. But we raised her to be strong and independent, to make her own choices. We cannot protect her from the world forever." "I do not want to protect her from the world. I want the world to be worthy of her," Garrett smiled. "Then we will simply have to make it so." With both children launched into their own lives, Violet and Garrett found themselves in a new phase. They were only in their early 40s, still strong and healthy, but aware that more years lay behind them than ahead. They talked about legacy, about what they wanted to leave behind when they were gone. It was Violet who proposed the idea of establishing a school, a place where people could come to learn wilderness skills in a structured way. Not just survival techniques, but also respect for the land, understanding of the native peoples who had lived here first, appreciation for the delicate balance between civilization and wilderness. Garrett embraced the idea wholeheartedly. Together, they built a second cabin on their land, larger than the first, with space for students to sleep and a central area for teaching. They reached out to mountain men and native peoples, inviting them to serve as guest instructors, sharing their unique knowledge and perspectives. The school started small, just a handful of students that first summer. But word spread, and each year more people came, drawn by the promise of learning from two of the most respected wilderness guides in the territory. Gabriel, when he was not guiding his own clients, often taught tracking and hunting skills. Grace, during her breaks from medical school, taught wilderness medicine and plant identification. As Violet and Garrett moved into their 50s and then their 60s, they slowed down but never stopped. They still took trips into the high country, though not as far or as frequently as before. They still welcomed students to their school, though they let younger instructors handle more of the physical teaching. On their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a community of people whose lives they had touched, Violet looked at Garrett across the crowded room and felt overwhelming gratitude. She caught his eye and he smiled, that same smile that had made her heart skip 30 years ago. That night, as they lay together in the bed they had shared for 3 decades, Violet traced the lines on Garrett's face, reading their history there. "You remember that day in the berry patch?" she asked. "When our life together began." "Every detail," Garrett replied. "You lying there with fear and determination in your eyes. The way you felt in my arms, so small and fragile but so strong. The moment I knew my life had just changed forever. You saved me that day, in more ways than one. We saved each other. You gave me a reason to be more than just a man surviving alone in the wilderness. You gave me love, family, purpose. You gave me a life worth living. And you gave me freedom, adventure, a love deeper than I ever imagined possible. You taught me that sometimes the greatest courage is choosing to be vulnerable, to let someone in despite the risk." They kissed, a sweet, familiar kiss that spoke of 3 decades of love and partnership. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. It sounded like a blessing, like the mountains themselves celebrating the life they had built. Gabriel took over the wilderness school as Violet and Garrett aged, bringing his own innovations and ideas while honoring the foundation his parents had laid. Grace returned from medical school and established a clinic in Leadville, using her unique combination of traditional medicine and native healing techniques to help people throughout the region. Both children married and had children of their own, filling Violet and Garrett's later years with the joy of grandchildren who ran wild through the forest, just as their parents had. On Violet's 70th birthday, the whole family gathered at the original cabin for a celebration. Children and grandchildren spilled out onto the porch and into the yard, 3 generations of Quinns laughing and telling stories around a roaring bonfire. As the evening grew late, and people began to drift toward their various sleeping arrangements, Violet found herself alone with Garrett, sitting in the rocking chairs on the porch they had added years ago. "Can you believe all of this came from a rattlesnake bite?" Violet said, laughing. "The snake was just the catalyst," Garrett replied. "What came after that was all us, our choices, our determination, our love." "True. But still, I like to think that snake was meant to cross my path that day, that everything happens for a reason and my reason was you. Then I suppose I should thank that snake, wherever it is now, probably dead of old age like we will be soon enough. I do not feel old when I am with you. I feel the same as I did 30, 40, 50 years ago, like the luckiest man alive." Violet reached over and took his hand, their fingers lacing together with the ease of long practice. "I love you, Garrett Quinn. I have loved you from that first moment when you came crashing through the brush like an avenging angel. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Violet Quinn. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. The very best." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one, the same stars they had watched on their wedding night, on countless nights since. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging while their lives had been anything but. Yet through all the changes, through all the challenges and joys and sorrows, one thing had remained constant: their love for each other. Violet and Garrett lived into their late 70s, a remarkable achievement for people of their time and lifestyle. When the end came, it came gently. Garrett passed first, in his sleep during a late autumn night, simply failing to wake one morning. Violet knew before she opened her eyes, felt his absence in the cold where warmth should be. She grieved deeply, but without regret. They had lived a full life together, had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. She knew Garrett would not want her to fall apart, so she held herself together for the funeral, accepting condolences from what seemed like half the territory. Violet lived 6 more months without her partner, spending her days with family and friends, sharing stories of their life together, ensuring that the wilderness school Gabriel ran would continue to honor the principles she and Garrett had established. She grew frailer as winter set in, but she remained clear-minded and sharp-tongued to the end. On a cold night in March, with Gabriel sitting vigil beside her bed and Grace holding her hand, Violet slipped away peacefully. Her last words were of Garrett, a whispered "I am coming" that made her children smile even through their tears. They buried her beside Garrett on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge where he had brought her on one of their first walks together. The entire community turned out for the funeral, speaking of the impact Violet had made, the lives she had touched, the legacy she and Garrett had created. The wilderness school thrived for decades more, eventually expanding to multiple locations throughout the Rockies. Gabriel's son took it over when Gabriel retired, and that son's daughter after him. The Quinn name became synonymous with wilderness education, with respect for the land and its original inhabitants, with the belief that humans could live in harmony with nature if they were willing to learn and adapt. Grace's medical clinic in Leadville became a model for integrated medicine, combining Western and native techniques in ways that benefited countless patients. Her children and grandchildren continued her work, establishing clinics throughout Colorado and beyond, always honoring the healing wisdom Winter Moon had passed down through Violet. The story of how Garrett and Violet met, the rattlesnake bite that brought them together, became something of a legend. It was told around campfires and dinner tables, each generation adding their own embellishments while keeping the essential truth intact. That sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best. That courage means choosing love even when it is terrifying. That two people from vastly different worlds can build something beautiful together if they are willing to try. And in the mountains of Colorado, in the valleys and ridges and high meadows, the Quinn legacy lived on. Not just in the descendants who bore the name, but in the countless people whose lives had been touched by the school, the clinic, the example of two people who had chosen to live according to their own rules while honoring the wisdom of those who came before. The cabin where it all began stood for over 100 years, carefully maintained by Quinn descendants who understood its importance. Eventually, it was donated to the state of Colorado and became a museum, a place where people could come to understand what life had been like in the early days of settlement, when the mountains were still wild and survival depended on skill, knowledge, and sheer determination. In the museum, carefully preserved, was Violet's original wicker basket, the one she had been carrying when the snake bit her. Beside it was the knife Garrett had used to extract the venom, and a beautiful quilt Violet had sewn from pieces of clothing spanning their entire marriage. There were photographs, too, grainy black and white images of Violet and Garrett in their later years, their faces weathered but their eyes still bright with love and life. Visitors to the museum often commented on those photographs, on the way the couple looked at each other, even in their old age. You could see the love there, profound and enduring, a testament to what could be built when two people chose each other against all odds and never wavered in that choice. And on summer nights, when the wind moved through the pines just right, some swore you could hear laughter echoing from the ridge where Violet and Garrett were buried. Whether it was simply the wind playing tricks or the spirits of two people who had loved the mountains in life and stayed to love them in death, no one could say for certain. But those who had known them, who had learned from them, who carried on their legacy, liked to think it was Violet and Garrett themselves. Still together after all these years, still in love, still watching over the land and the people they had devoted their lives to protecting and teaching. It was a fitting end to a love story that had begun with danger and fear, but had blossomed into something extraordinary. A reminder that sometimes the worst days of our lives are actually the beginning of our best days, if we are brave enough to seize the opportunities they present. The rattlesnake that bit Violet Grayson on that summer day in 1879 had no way of knowing the chain of events it was setting in motion. It was simply being a snake, protecting itself from a perceived threat. But in doing so, it brought together two souls that were meant to find each other, two people who would build a life and a legacy that touched thousands. And that, perhaps, was the real magic of the story. Not that it was a fairy tale or impossibly romantic, but that it was real. Two real people who had faced real challenges and made real choices, building something beautiful and lasting through hard work, dedication, and unwavering love. Their story became a beacon for others who felt trapped by convention, who yearned for something more but did not know how to reach for it. It proved that it was possible to forge your own path, to create a life that aligned with your deepest values and desires, to find love in the most unexpected places. And so the story of Garrett and Violet Quinn lived on, generation after generation, inspiring others to be brave, to choose love, to honor both the wisdom of the past and the possibilities of the future. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth carrying forward into whatever future awaited. In the end, that was the true measure of a life well lived, not in wealth accumulated or status achieved, but in the positive impact left on the world and the people in it. By that measure, Garrett and Violet Quinn's life together was an unqualified success, a love story for the ages, and a legacy that would never be forgotten.